Good evening and welcome to the show. I'm Sharri. Here's what's coming up on the program. Labor ministers Tony Burke and Chris Bowen under fire for their response to the attacks in Israel. Burke has failed to directly condemn a preacher who said he was elated at the murder of Israelis, while Bowen has been silent for days on the attacks in Israel. Standing by in the face of anti-Semitism is unacceptable for Cabinet ministers and the Albanese government, and I'll discuss this with Shadow Home Affairs Minister James Paterson later in the show. Also tonight, the inside story of the capture of a mother, her 4-year-old boy and her 4-month-old baby. I'll be joined by New South Wales Opposition Leader Mark Speakman and Jeremy Liebler to discuss the latest in Israel and the fallout from the Opera House debacle. Plus, it's 4 days out from the Voice referendum. Albanese visits Uluru. How will the Voice's likely defeat affect his leadership? Paul Murray and Liz Storer coming up. But first, to the New South Wales Labor government that last night protected those celebrating terrorism while telling Jews to stay at home. It's not just the Gaza Strip that's a no-go zone. New South Wales Police declared Sydney's CBD and the Opera House unsafe for Australian Jews. It's unthinkable that there could be such cruelty towards innocent families, mothers, babies and children as we've witnessed in Israel. Yet it seems some of our fellow Australians are celebrating the horrors that have had the rest of us in deep distress. First, in Lakemba, in Sydney's southwest on Sunday night, we saw Australians celebrating after the terror attacks in Israel.
I'm smiling. I'm smiling and I'm happy. I'm elated. It's a day of courage. It's a day of happiness. It's a day of pride. It's a day of victory. This is the day we've been waiting for.
And that is the preacher. Those are the comments that Tony Burke wouldn't directly condemn, and I'll come back to that a bit later in the show. Then there's video of this group driving around the streets in Greenacre, also in Sydney, letting off firecrackers and yelling Allahu Akbar.
Live from Greenacre. Live from Greenacre.
And then perhaps the most egregious, a rally in the heart of Sydney CBD, where protesters burned the Israeli flag and yelled death to the Jews and gassed the Jews. And a warning that this is very distressing. How has this day come when New South Wales Police told Jews to stay in their homes because it's simply not safe to walk on Sydney's streets? But that's what the New South Wales government did last night. Instead of reining in the protesters, instead of breaking up the crowds, putting an end to the threats of violence, the aggression, the fire, the police allowed the protest to take place. The hatred from the Middle East suddenly very real on the steps of our iconic Opera House. We have had the shambles of the Minns government allowing a vile protest to be conducted on the steps of our national icon, which was last night meant to be lit up in blue and white in solidarity with Israel. But the New South Wales government allowed Australians, as many of these protesters are, to use our national symbol to project images of hate globally. The pictures that beamed around the world provided moral support to terrorists who are murdering young families. Instead of taking action to rein in the protest, the New South Wales government acted in a cowardly way. They handed over the Opera House as a platform to, as you've seen, those chanting "Death to the Jews, gas the Jews." The Opera House now tainted by the vilest of sentiments imaginable against humans. This is what appeasement looks like. It's shameful, and it's a sign of a weak government that failed to act against those openly threatening Jews on the steps of our national icon. And instead of arresting any of the aggressive anti-Semitic protesters, the only known arrest last night was of a single Jewish man holding the Israeli flag. Mark Spiro, stupidly or bravely, whichever way you look at it, he went to the rally holding this Israeli flag. He was arrested. Police today defended their actions and said they were protecting him.
I've done nothing wrong, mate. I've just done nothing wrong.
This is really unfair, guys.
Mate, I've done nothing
really unfair.
Arrested.
What for? What's he being arrested for?
I've done nothing wrong.
Tell us what he's being arrested for.
Arresting my friend.
What have I done? Just tell me what I've done. Stop.
Why is he being arrested? Sydney, Australia, and this is what happens.
In relation to a breach of the peace.
Why? He's got a flag. He hasn't done anything.
A person was removed from the town hall rally who was carrying a flag for his safety. He was arrested to prevent a breach of the peace for his safety. He was removed and released.
And Caroline Marcus reports that Mark Spiro is now considering his legal options. But a lot has been said in the Voice debate on the image that a no vote will project to the world. But here we see images of the New South Wales government giving a public platform for encouragement of murderous terror beamed around the world. This is Australia 2023. Arrest Jews for their safety and provide safe passage for murderous slogans and celebration of terror. The New South Wales Attorney General, Michael Daly, repeated the comments today that people should stay home. And worse, he drew an equivalence between the supporters of terrorism and Jewish Australians. Appalling comments on Ben Fordham's show this morning.
Everybody needs to just calm down and, as you say, do stay at home.
Well, what's the point in lighting up the sales of the Opera House and then telling Jewish people to stay home for their own safety?
I think all people should stay home for their own safety if the streets are unsafe. But
is New South Wales and Sydney unsafe?
Well, I'm confident that the police have got the streets under control, as they always do.
Now, that whole conversation with Michael Daly, well, they were pretty shocking comments from the New South Wales Attorney General. He spoke about dividing into teams, but there is no equivalence here. There has been a terror attack on innocent families. The opposition in New South Wales has accused the government of failing in their duty to ensure the safety and protection of Jewish Australians. And as I said, Opposition Leader Mark Speakman will be on my show tonight. He says the Police Minister is missing in action. Well, New South Wales Premier Chris Minns responded by saying this today.
They're the opposite of what we want in our modern multicultural community. To have some people celebrate atrocious, indiscriminate killing and kidnapping in Israel is appalling. And I think that at the end of the day, this is the opposite of the dynamic multicultural community that we want in New South Wales and Australia.
The Australian's political editor Simon Benson writes that the Police Minister Yasmin Catley should resign. He says it's almost beyond belief that Jewish residents of Sydney have been told to stay in their homes because the police can't guarantee their safety. He writes this is nothing short of a disgrace and the Police Minister Yasmin Catley should resign for allowing this to happen. He says she has to bear ultimate responsibility for the decision, which flies in the face of the decision by her Premier Chris Minns to light up the Opera House in the first place as a mark of respect to the Jewish community. But even after all of this, Yasmin Catley is refusing to apologise, and there were calls for her to do so in Parliament today.
The Minister owes our community, our Jewish community, an apology. apology.
The minister would apologise for what happened last night, and she has not come close.
So, Minister, if you could be directly relevant.
The New South Wales Police Force recognises and supports the rights of individuals and groups to exercise their rights of free speech and peaceful assembly. However, the first priority for the New South Wales Police is always the safety of the wider community. Mr Speaker, I encourage any person or group who has been the target of hate crime or incident to report this to the New South Wales Police.
I mean, that's unacceptable. She's had a shocker. As Ben Fordham said today, it's conflicting messages. The New South Wales government is lighting up the Opera House sails in blue and white in solidarity with Israel, but then telling Jews the steps of the Opera House are not safe for them, that police can't protect them. It is disgraceful. Well, the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, condemned the protest today, and Peter Dutton said it shouldn't even have gone ahead in the first place.
I've now seen the images just recently, and they're horrific, quite clearly. Slogans which are anti-Semitic and just appalling with no place.
People can protest peacefully. That is a right. People can express their view, even if we disagree with it in our country. But some of the conduct last night was appalling, and frankly, there should have been a lot more done to deter that gathering from taking place in the first instance.
It's not just in Sydney that we're seeing scenes like this. All around the world, Jews are in hiding while pro-Palestinian protesters take to the streets. This outside the White House. And this outside of Toronto. And protesters in New York made it clear that the end goal isn't even the Jews, it's everyone.
We're done being tortured and hurt and judged. This is the correct religion. This is the religion that all of humanity needs to be upon, of Islam. And we will not stop until it enters every home. So I want you to repeat after me. I want to hear it in every single district. It should tremble. Brooklyn should hear it. The Bronx should hear it. Queens should hear it. Say it as if the Ummah depends on this, my brothers and sisters. La ilaha illallah. Muhammadan Rasulullah. There is no God worthy of worship except Allah, the God of Jesus, the God of Moses, the God of Abraham, and the God of the last and final prophet Muhammad.
But what we saw in Sydney last night isn't just anti-Semitism, it is hate speech, and it's unlawful. Yet no apology from the police minister, no backing down. There needs to be accountability. Free speech, of course, we applaud, even if we disagree with it. But hate speech is unacceptable, and it's far from the values that we hold dear in Western civilization. Right, the Australian's chief political correspondent, Jeff Chambers, joins me now. Jeff, I mean, rather than standing in solidarity with the Opera House lit up in blue and white, the Jewish community told to stay at home, and instead of shutting down that rally of hatred, the New South Wales Police and the New South Wales government allowed it to go ahead, you'd have to say for political reasons. How is this acceptable?
Oh, it's completely unacceptable, Sharri. We can't give terrorist sympathisers and anti-Semites a licence to stoke division, and this is what they're seeking to do around the world. The New South Wales Police has many times and absolutely can, and in this case, this wasn't a lawful gathering. They could have banned the protest. I mean, less than 48 hours after this horrific rampage through Israel by Hamas terrorists and murderers, at a time when we're lighting up the Opera House in solidarity with Israelis, how on earth can Australian Jewish people be told to stay at home because the New South Wales Police cannot guarantee their safety in the heart of the Sydney CBD? How on earth can this mob be allowed to walk down the streets chanting anti-Semitic slogans, heading up to the Opera House, a landmark of this country, light up flares, burn the Israeli flag and shout anti-Semitic slogans? It's beyond disgraceful. And for Chris Minns to come out this morning and say these words of, this is absolutely terrible, we'll be looking at CCTV footage. Where was he yesterday? He's the Premier of the state. He has an incompetent police minister, an incompetent Attorney General. We've seen that today. The buck stops with the Premier. He needed to be across this yesterday. He said he was talking to people yesterday. Well, where was he? And where was the Police Commissioner? I mean, we've seen too many cases recently where the New South Wales Police Force is not doing what it should be doing.
Yeah, and you've written a very strong piece about all of this for The Australian, Jeff. Now, also one of your colleagues at The Australian has a story online this afternoon, a big story, that Labor ministers Tony Burke and Chris Bowen are under fire for showing a lack of leadership, for not adequately coming out to criticise the attacks that we've seen in Israel. Tony Burke failed to condemn that preacher in his electorate who said that he was elated at the murder of Israeli civilians, and I played that clip already on the show tonight. And then meanwhile, Chris Bowen seemed to sidestep condemning the Hamas attacks outright. He merely said that he supported the Prime Minister's position. And we know that Alex Rivkin, he's from the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, he said that their silences show a complete lack of leadership when it's needed the most. But Jeff, these are two very senior members of the Albanese government, they're cabinet ministers. These are some of the worst terror attacks we have seen in years. Babies, children, women, innocent people slaughtered in their homes, 260 people, young people at a dance party gunned down. Jeff, how can they not adequately condemn a preacher in Tony Burke's case who says he's elated at this, and in Chris Bowen's case just say he supports what Albanese says?
It's awful, Sharri, and this is politics. These seats that they represent have very strong Islamic populations, and they don't wish to upset those leaders in their community. It's unbelievable. And when we look around the world, Paris had a peaceful gathering of thousands of people who sang the Israeli national anthem as the Eiffel Tower was lit up. Rishi Sunak delivered a strong speech in a synagogue in London declaring his support for Jewish people and for Israelis. What are we seeing here at a federal level? Have they held an NSC meeting? Has there been a press conference in the Prime Minister's courtyard? We've heard that there's been some national security briefings. Well, what does it mean for Australia? What's happening on the ground? I think that there's been a real, we get this rhetoric of condemnation, but then there's always the other element for some in the Labor Party to talk about two states and the Israelis and Palestinians living in peaceful harmony. Well, right now, what happened on the weekend needs to be addressed, and Australians need to hear what those implications could mean for them. And in terms of this kind of divisive activity in places like Lakemba, it has to be absolutely not only condemned, but attacked. And the police should be looking into all these things.
Exactly. And there are laws and provisions in place for inciting violence, and if individuals have incited violence, then the police need to act. But to think that Chris Bowen once fancied himself a future Prime Minister, well, someone who can't even come out and strongly condemn what we've seen, there's no leadership role for him in this country. Now, I want to turn
I'll give Bill Shorten. I'll give Bill Shorten and Richard Marles. I think they've been probably the strongest. They're of the right faction, but
yes.
I think their comments to date have been probably the strongest from the cabinet.
Yeah, and Bill Shorten has always been a strong supporter of Israel. Now, I want to turn to, some of those who've been abducted, some of the victims in Israel. Very difficult to talk about these stories because they're so traumatic. The Australian newspaper, the Adelaide Advertiser today, both dedicated front pages to showing the pictures of the victims. One of the stories is particularly extraordinary. It's a woman who was at a kibbutz in Israel. She was there with her 4-year-old little boy and a 4-month-old baby. And they were kidnapped, taken hostage. They were trying to bunker down in a shelter, but then they were found, they were taken hostage by the terrorists. According to the reports from her family members, which is in the Australian, the little boy, the 4-year-old, was shot. He had a bullet in his leg and he was crying so much and the terrorists couldn't take the crying, so they dumped the trio out of the car, out of their vehicle into the desert. And hopefully, the reports are that hopefully the young mother, her 4-year-old boy and the 4-month-old baby have been able to make it to safety. I mean, this is just extraordinary.
It's just so tragic, unthinkable, particularly for those with kids and particularly for Jewish Australians with family and friends on the ground. I mean, people have to remember this is still a live operation in terms of recovery, and we're hearing every day new tragic tales and stories of what these Hamas murderers have done on the ground, and it's I think it's just absolutely awful, but really important that these people are remembered and these stories are told.
All right. Jeff Chambers, thank you so much for joining me tonight. After the break, New South Wales opposition leader Mark Speakman will join me to talk about that disgraceful protest at the Opera House last night and why it was allowed to take place in Sydney. That's after this. Welcome back. Well, let's bring in now New South Wales opposition leader Mark Speakman. Mark, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Sharri.
Look, what's your reaction to the rally that we saw at Sydney Opera House last night, and do you think it should have been allowed to go ahead?
Well, it certainly should not have been allowed to go ahead. There was a protest yesterday at Town Hall, and the protesters, the mob, should not have been allowed to march through the streets of Sydney to the Opera House. The Opera House was being lit up in solidarity with Israeli citizens who had been massacred, and their families and their friends and their loved ones here in Sydney. That should have been an occasion for the Jewish community locally to grieve, to reflect solemnly on what had happened, but they were denied that opportunity because a group was allowed by this government to hijack the occasion and have an ugly protest on the steps of Parliament, on the steps of the Opera House.
And what do you think about this direction to tell Jewish Australians effectively that the streets aren't safe for them, the streets in the heart of Sydney CBD, on the steps of the Opera House, that it's not safe for them and that they should stay at home?
Well, that's an appalling set of circumstances that a community like the Jewish community in New South Wales is not safe on our streets. What should have happened is that the mob should not have been allowed to descend on the Opera House in the way they did, and instead we see the ugly scenes, the anti-Semitic slogans, the hate speech, the burning of a flag, the lighting of flames. None of that should have been allowed to happen, and this lays at the feet of the government. It's all very well for the Premier, as he's done, to express strong support for Israel and a condemnation of what's happened overseas, but the government has been missing in action in allowing this protest to descend in the ugly way it has on the Opera House.
What do you think of the decision by the Police Minister Yasmin Catley not to apologise today? Do you think that she should resign? And I know that there have been calls for her to step down.
Well, I think she should reflect on her position. The Police Minister is a serial non-performer. She was missing on Tasergate, the tasering of Claire Nowland and the lack of transparency there. There's a report on domestic violence gathering dust on her deck. She was missing in action when there were shootings in Western Sydney and school kids were seeing dead bodies there. And now she's been missing in action on this. An active police minister would have... She told Parliament today that she had been in constant contact with the police, and yet she has not lifted a finger. She has not said anything to stop this protester standing on the Opera House last night. So she has been a continual failure as police minister.
What's your assessment about the safety in Sydney, Australia, for the Jewish community? I mean, you know, these terror attacks took place in Israel, but we have seen preachers express elation at the slaughter. We've seen a lot of people celebrate this week in those southwest communities. Well, is it safe for the Jewish community? Even the Prime Minister has said there's been a rise of anti-Semitism and racism.
Well, ultimately, you'd have to ask the Police Commissioner and the Police Minister that. We had the extraordinary situation today of the Attorney General on radio this morning saying people should stay in their homes, telling the Jewish community and the community more generally that if it's not safe on the streets, stay in your home. That's an appalling abrogation of responsibility. We had the Attorney General this morning on Breakfast Radio not even knowing what had happened last night. And this is the senior law officer in New South Wales. So you've got a police minister who won't say anything to the police about stopping this mob descending on the Opera House. You've got an Attorney General who doesn't even know what's going on. You've got a Premier who, unlike the Prime Minister, did not call on the protesters to desist. You've got multiple failures by this government.
Now, Mark Speakman, obviously now you're opposition leader, but you used to be the Attorney General of this state. What charges are there available for those last night who were shouting, "Death to the Jews, gas the Jews"?
Well, look, I'm not going to comment directly on whether there has been any breach of the criminal law in case there are prosecutions, but I'll speak at a more general level. When we were in government, we introduced new provisions in the Crimes Act, making it a criminal offence to incite violence or threaten violence on the basis of race or religion. That's something the police could look at. There are also federal laws about assisting terrorist organisations. There are general criminal law provisions about breaches of the peace, devices like flames and so on. There's a wide variety of offences that the police could look at.
And you think they should do so?
Well, definitely. They say they are reviewing the situation. They're looking at footage. Apparently, they've got CCTV coverage. But what would have been better is stopping this abhorrent behaviour in the first place.
Absolutely.
The police minister should have been. She said she was in constant contact with the police. Well, what was she doing? What was she doing? She was asleep at the wheel. She should have been demanding to know why this protest couldn't be prevented. The Attorney General should have been across his brief, and when he went on Breakfast Radio this morning, know what happened to the Opera House last night.
Yeah,
the Premier should have been telling protesters they should be desist. And the Multicultural Minister, Steve Camper, is nowhere to be seen. He was joking big time today in Question Time about parking in Moore Park. To my knowledge, hasn't said a word publicly about this abhorrent behaviour. And you've got the Multiculturalism Parliamentary Secretary, whose son was part of the protest. Now, of course, that Parliamentary Secretary can't be responsible for his adult son's behaviour. I'm not suggesting that. But he needs to repudiate very clearly that behaviour, and if he doesn't, he should resign or he should be sacked.
All right, Mark Speakman, thank you very much for your time. Well, Hamas has threatened to execute the 100 or 160 people that they are holding hostage if Israel targets Gaza. In an audio recording, a Hamas spokesman said, in the face of indiscriminately attacking our residential areas, killing women, children and the elderly, and as our enemy does not understand the values or ethics, I mean, how can they speak of values and ethics? Then anyway, this is the Hamas statement. They say, we announce that any targeting of innocent civilians without warning will be met regretfully by executing one of the hostages in our custody, and we will be forced to broadcast this execution. It is a final warning and it is an ultimatum. So Hamas, they're saying that they're going to start executing hostages and broadcast the video of it. I mean, we're talking ISIS-style beheadings here. You know, public videos of executions of innocent women, children, families, the elderly. Here's what Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's Prime Minister, had to say.
Israel is at war. We didn't want this war. It was forced upon us in the most brutal and savage way. But though Israel didn't start this war, Israel will finish it. Hamas will understand that by attacking us, they've made a mistake of historic proportions. We will exact a price that will be remembered by them and Israel's other enemies for decades to come.
Shadow Minister for Home Affairs, Senator James Paterson, joins me now. James Paterson, I mean, how does Israel handle this now? Israel has to retaliate. It has to crush Hamas, these terrorists. It has to protect its citizens. What do you think we're going to start seeing? Public videos of executions?
Sharri, in this conflict so far, we've had a lot of the usual business as usual rhetoric that Israel has a right to exist and Israel has a right to defend itself. But this goes far beyond just the normal border skirmishes or clashes or small-scale attacks that we've seen in the past. This is the most serious assault on the sovereign state of Israel, at least since 1973 in the Yom Kippur War, but arguably it goes back even further than that. And so Israel is going to have to respond in a very decisive fashion. There is no liberal democracy in the world that would tolerate having a terrorist state on its borders that poses an existential risk to its people in perpetuity. Any state, any democracy, including Australia, would want to deal with that and deal with that decisively, and I expect that they will do so. Unfortunately, that will involve civilian casualties on the Palestinian side, and that is because that's what Hamas wants. Hamas undertakes these operations by design to try and ensure that there are Palestinian casualties so that they can use that as a propaganda tool against Israel and say, look at all these innocent civilians that have been killed. But they take steps to make sure that happens. For example, they host their munitions in civilian areas, in apartment buildings, in schools, even in hospitals, because they know that the Israeli Defence Force will be reluctant to target them, and they know if they do target them that innocent civilians will be killed in the process. So any civilian deaths that occur from here on in are solely the responsibility of Hamas, who has initiated this conflict.
Even so, it's going to be just truly horrifying if we enter that phase of the execution of hostages. James, Jess Malcolm, a journalist at The Australian, has put up a story this afternoon looking at the response of Tony Burke and Chris Bowen to these attacks in Israel. Tony Burke failed to condemn a preacher in his electorate, or failed to properly condemn a preacher in his electorate, who said he was elated by the atrocities in Israel. And Chris Bowen, meanwhile, hasn't even commented at all. He just says he supports what Anthony Albanese has to say. What's your reaction to two senior members of the Albanese government reacting in this way to what have been some of the worst terror attacks this decade?
Sharri, believe it or not, in Canberra, both Tony Burke and Chris Bowen fancy themselves as future leaders of the Labor Party and future leaders of this country. Well, they have demonstrated a total absence of leadership in this. Some of the worst instances of protests and incitement to violence in Australia have happened in their electorates, and they should take a leadership responsibility and step up and say, this is not okay, this is not acceptable, and we don't stand for it. And they should stand with the people of Israel, the innocent civilians of Israel, the men, women, children, the elderly, who've been murdered in their streets, murdered in their homes, abducted, kidnapped, taken back to Gaza, and are right now being tortured and held hostage by a terrorist state. These are totally unacceptable things, and any political leader who fails to condemn them unequivocally and clearly is failing a test of leadership and should be ashamed of themselves.
But just failing basic human decency and human values. I mean, how can you put politics? These are the people that clearly they're courting the votes of. It's truly shocking. James, I also want to ask you about your reaction to the Opera House scenes last night.
I'm deeply disturbed by what we've seen at the Opera House last night, Sharri, and I am worried that similar protests are planned in Melbourne tonight, and I fear that we will see similar scenes again. These protests have struck fear in the hearts of the Jewish community in Australia, who are worried about what it means to them that people are so willing to so openly and brazenly express their hatred and contempt for their fellow Australians who happen to be of Jewish heritage. It's an appalling thing. It should not happen in this country, and it says something very profoundly depressing about this country, that people think this is an appropriate way to behave. The organisers of these rallies need to take responsibility for this. They need to police their own movement and make sure the people who engage in this behaviour never do so again. Because there's one accusation that pro-Palestinian activists object most strongly to, and that is that when they're accused of anti-Semitism. Well, we saw anti-Semitism on the streets of Sydney last night, displayed by Palestinian activists, and any Palestinian leader in Australia who refuses to unequivocally condemn it is guilty by association.
All right, James Patterson, thank you so much for joining me this evening. And coming up, Paul Murray and Liz Storer on the Voice debate, getting not just heated, but even physically violent. That's after this quick break. If you're just tuning in, here are the top 5 stories you need to know tonight. Benjamin Netanyahu declares his country will win the war against Hamas savages as the conflict's death toll surpasses 1,500. The New South Wales Police Minister confirmed last night's Sydney Opera House rally did not have police approval to go ahead, as footage emerges showing the crowd chant "Gas the Jews." A man has been charged over a serious assault at a pre-polling booth in Ipswich as tensions rise between yes and no voters in the final week of the campaign. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is launching an independent bid for the presidency, breaking away from the Democratic Party so closely tied with his family. And the Australian drug regulator is investigating popular weight loss and diabetes jab Ozempic over several reports of intestinal obstructions in those using the drug. All right, for tonight's panel, let's bring in Sky News hosts Paul Murray and Liz Storer. Wonderful to see you guys.
Hello. Hello.
On a Tuesday. Look, let's start with The Voice. We're 4 days out now. I mean, it's been months and months we've been talking about it. 4 days out, we're nearly there. Paul, do you have a prediction of what the final national percentage is going to be?
Well, the funny way is that if I said no, that would be both a prediction and an answer to your question. Yes. Look, my expectation is no. All of the polling, it would have to be a bigger polling failure than Trump. It'd have to be a bigger polling failure than 2019. It's multiple polls, multiple organisations since July have all shown that it's south. My 2019 wasn't inevitable. What's going to happen on Saturday feeling is I think that it's very close in New South Wales and Victoria. I think that the data we get out of Tasmania, which says that it's going to go yes, means if that's the case, then it's all down to South Australia. Now, again, most of the published polling says it's not going to get up in New South Wales, not going to get up in Victoria. But if it does, then the path is going to be a lot quicker, obviously. But you asked me for the prediction, it will be no, and even if they get the majority of states, they won't get the majority of people, and that in and of itself kills them.
Yeah. What do you think it'll be, national majority, the national majority for no? What do you think the figure's going to be? Like a slight no, or do you think it's going to be as strong as, 60-40?
I think it's going to be resounding, and that's absolutely why Anthony Albanese knows this, and on Sunday was like really peddling back everything I said about legislating a voice regardless of the referendum outcome. This guy knows there is a difference between a resounding thumping, being crushed like a bug, and just a defeat. And he knows his own numbers are telling him it's going to be the fall.
And you could see that he was starting to blame Jacinta Price.
Well, 100%.
But also,
it's already begun.
Like, how clueless is this bloke? That he goes to Broken Hill for 2 minutes to refuel, then he goes to Uluru. That's the sort of act that you do as the final push when you're the one that's leading everywhere. Instead, he's just trying to project this.
The photo ops.
Completely unnecessary, completely
always with
ridiculous.
The Kubra hat.
Well, and I tell you what, if you want to know the greatest sign of confidence about what Anthony Albanese really thinks about The Voice, he voted last weekend, so he didn't have the pictures of him voting this weekend. That might tell you he's not quite really backing.
And I just think if he was a man of conviction, he would legislate it regardless. If he has, he has told us
how angry Australians would be if they've just been asked to go to a referendum that's cost millions of dollars, and he was going to, legislate it in.
But the
couldn't
referendum component of that was always the constitutional change. We always knew they could have legislated it regardless. We know that Dutz has made moves in that direction itself, so he would have legitimate excuses to be like, look, it's going to happen anyway. But All I'm saying is if he was a man of conviction, and he's told us many times with tears in his eyes, this is going to change the games for every Indigenous Australian in modern-day Australia for the rest of history, etc., and so on. If he actually believed that, you'd have to believe that he would legislate it regardless.
All right, let's move on to Robert F. Kennedy. Paul, it looks like he might be on the cusp of launching an independent bid for the presidency, not running with the Democrats. What do you think? I mean, he is emerging as quite a popular candidate.
He is.
Well, even if he takes, no, he obviously won't be president, but even if he takes 1%.
Hey, George Washington pulled it off.
Well, he ain't no George Washington, mate. He ain't no George Washington. But let's imagine that there is a 1% in a particular state that's going to back him, or 2% in a particular state, which comes off Biden, which comes off Trump. The reality is when a third-party candidate runs, they can be the difference between one of the majors winning in places where they had expected to win, and people basically choose Team Red or Team Blue as the lesser of two evils.
Yeah.
Now, there's plenty about RFK that the hard left will like about corporations. There's plenty of people that still have their views, and quite rightly so, about COVID restrictions, vaccines, big pharma. Now, whether it hurts or Biden or Trump, I don't know. But do I think in many, many swing states there's about 1% of people that are willing to say no to either? Yes.
Yeah.
So I think this is quite consequential.
And then do you think this ends up helping Trump, Liz? Because if he does detract, say mainly from the Democratic voters who's running, but as you say, there will be Republicans who like him. But say he mainly detracts from Democratic voters because Republicans are still sticking with Trump. Does that mean that Trump is more likely to end up in the White House?
I'd say so. With someone like this guy helping him out, yes, because like you say, there are definitely going to be people in many states who are like, I don't want to vote for either of these. There's a lot of Dems who have woken up to the fact that their fearless leader is a senile old man incapable of leading, and there's a lot of people pulling his strings. He's more acting as a puppet at this point in time, and they'll be looking to vote elsewhere as well. So even if they may not have voted for Kennedy as a Dem, they would vote for him as an independent. And those Republicans that aren't too fussed on Trump would also consider this guy. He's come out with many Trumpian-sounding policies and stances on from big pharma to massive corporations, etc., and so on. So he's run a very impressive campaign to date.
One thing I'll say is I think he'll end up being the preferred podcast and YouTubers candidate for people who don't want to go with the baggage of Trump and obviously don't like Biden. So that lane, as big or as small as it is in American politics. Now, remember, again, if we talk about, say, 100,000 people in a state like Pennsylvania, that can tip that state. Now, that's a state that basically Republicans never assumed to win. Trump won in 16. However, if the union message is the one that's going to move those 100,000 people, that's what brings Trump into play. So I assume he will have 20 different messages in 20 different places.
Sure. But
watch this space, and he'll be all over those YouTube shows that are watched by millions of people.
Yeah, and the likes of Kennedy have been on with Joe Rogan, who is the biggest podcaster in the known universe.
Yeah, although I haven't liked his podcasts on Israel Today, that's for sure.
I get it.
Paul Murray, Liz Story, great to see you. We'll see you 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock on the telly.
Love you.
Cheers.
After the break, Jewish schools are telling their students it's okay not to wear their blazers this week. I'll be joined by Zionist Federation's President Jeremy Liebler after the break. Well, many of Australia's landmarks were lit up in blue and white last night in solidarity with Israel. But at the same time, the New South Wales Police allowed an unauthorised anti-Israel pro-Hamas rally to go ahead despite no application being filed, despite the fact that Hamas is a terrorist group, and despite the fact that those present then chanted, "Gas the Jews." Jeremy Liebler is the president of the Zionist Federation of Australia, and he joins me from Melbourne now. Welcome to the program, Jeremy. What's your reaction to the rallies that we've seen in Sydney this week and that are planned for Melbourne tonight?
Well, it's terrifying, Sharri. There aren't really other words to describe it. I'm a second-generation Holocaust survivor. I come from a family of Holocaust survivors. I have aunties that were in Auschwitz, and I grew up very much under the shadow of the Holocaust. And the notion that I would have to explain to my children that there are people walking the streets of Sydney yelling, "Gas the Jews," is just incomprehensible.
And what do you think about the police here in New South Wales telling the Jewish community to stay home, not to go to the city, the heart of Sydney, and not to go to the Opera House, our national icon, instead of actually shutting down this protest?
Yeah, well, I think we need to actually understand and look at what sits behind that advice. And so on the one hand, I have no doubt that the police's intentions were well, perhaps to protect any Jewish members of the community that would be nearby, so to stay away. But that's not acceptable, because that's effectively blaming the victim. It's akin to saying to women, stay home, otherwise you'll be raped. And that would be completely unacceptable. So we need to ask ourselves, who are the enablers of this sort of behaviour? And Sharri, the enablers are spread all throughout society, frankly, both on the left and on the right. And one needs to only start looking at our universities to understand why this is normalised, because universities have normalised this sort of rhetoric without calling it out and calling it as unacceptable.
And we've got breaking news.
And if you just want a simple example...
No, go ahead, yep.
If you just want a simple example, look at the University of Sydney, where they sent out a letter to all of their students asking both Israeli and Palestinian students if they need support given events in Israel and Palestine, as if there is some sort of equal-footed war or dispute going on amongst two like-minded or differently minded countries, when in fact one side, a terrorist organisation, has perpetuated a mass atrocity on the other.
It's shocking, and University of Sydney has a very poor record on this. Jeremy, the community security group, it's known as the CSG. For anyone who hasn't heard of it, it's Jewish security. It's raised the national threat level in Australia to severe. The Jewish community is on heightened alert in light of the war in Israel. That's what the CSG says. What does this mean? What is the threat level like at the moment in Australia for Jews?
Well, I'll tell you what it means. It means that Jewish families are not letting their children walk around the streets unaccompanied. It means that Jewish families are, and both children and adults, are not walking around with identifiably Jewish, clothing or dress, because they don't feel safe around the streets. And it means that on like tonight in Melbourne, where a rally similar to that took place in Sydney is being planned in Melbourne, that frankly, they are staying as far away from the city as possible because they are fearful for their own safety.
And do you think it's safe for Jewish parents to be sending their children to Jewish schools this week?
You know, I don't think that you need an expert to answer the question, is it safe? But the real question is, terrorism is designed to instill terror and fear. And the effect of what's happening in Israel and the effect of the rhetoric and the behaviour of people within the pro-Palestinian and parts of the Muslim community here in Australia has created that fear. The difference is, today, here in Australia, I'm very grateful that we have strong bipartisan political support. About 15 minutes ago, when I was waiting outside the studio, I received a call from the Premier of Victoria, and who assured me that they were monitoring the rally, that the mistakes that took place in Sydney would not take place, that police were properly briefed. And I'm hopeful that that will come to fruition. And the fact that we had both the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, and both the state leaders as well condemn the rhetoric and the behaviour at these rallies is extremely important.
Yeah. All right, Jeremy Liebler, thank you so much for your time. That's all we've got time for today. Thank you for watching. I'll see you 5 o'clock tomorrow, and here's Peter Credlin.